Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are really going to dig into one of the most essential texts of American literature, Harper Lee's 1960 novel, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Right. And we're looking at this novel not just as a story about a moral hero, but more as a stack of sources, really. A blueprint that reveals the rigid, almost unforgiving social mechanics of a place like Macomb County, Alabama.
Exactly. We're asking a structural question here.
Our core question today is, structural. How do these deeply entrenched social, racial, and economic hierarchies, how do they dictate community behavior and even judicial outcomes, especially when they're faced with just overwhelming moral clarity?
I think everyone remembers Atticus Finch as this moral compass.
Of course.
But if we only focus on his individual goodness, we miss the larger and I think more terrifying truth of the book.
And what is that truth?
It's the systemic blueprint. We're here to analyze how the systems in Macomb, specifically those rooted in racial superiority, how they prioritize their own maintenance, their own stability over any kind of objective truth.
So this deep dive is really moving beyond the individual, beyond just Atticus.
Yeah, we're focusing on the institutional failures. We're looking at the complex class structures, the inert school system, the totally rigged court, and even how community narratives can create and destroy innocent people, the Mockingbirds.
It's an analysis of why the system produced these tragic outcomes back in the 1930s.
And why those same patterns of perception and enforcement, still feel distressingly relevant to our institutions today.
It's a lot to unpack. Let's get started.
Okay,
So let's unpack the context first. To Kill a Mockingbird comes out in 1960, wins the Pulitzer Prize, and it becomes this immediate seismic classic.
it really does. But I think the book's authority, its real power, comes from the author's deep, almost genetic knowledge of the setting she's writing about.
You mean Harper Lee's own background?
Absolutely. She was born in Monroeville, Alabama, which is, it's the undeniable inspiration for the fictional Macomb.
So this wasn't an outsider's perspective.
Not at all. This wasn't a story written by someone just observing the South from a distance. This was a deep excavation, performed by someone who was intimately familiar with all the social rules, all the unspoken contracts of that world. She wasn't just describing the town, she was describing her home.
And the overlaps between her real life and the fiction, they're pretty profound, aren't they? It gives a character like Atticus Finch so much authenticity.
It really does. Her own father, Amasa Coleman Lee, he was a lawyer, an editor, and he served in the state legislature.
Just like Atticus.
Just like Atticus. That background gave Harper Lee this firsthand insight into the inner mechanics of Southern law and politics, and that lends just immense weight to the courtroom scenes.
So Atticus isn't just some idealized hero.
No, his career path, this quiet, small-town lawyer who sometimes serves in the State House, even participating in that emergency session to reorganize the tax systems, that detail mirrors her father's influence so closely. It grounds the character not just in moral idealism, but in a deep, practical knowledge of the law and, crucially, its failures.
And that knowledge is so important because of the setting. The book is published in 1960, right at the peak of the civil rights movement. But it's explicitly set much earlier.
Right, in the mid-1930s, the absolute economic abyss of the Great Depression.
Macomb is described as a tired old town, isn't it?
A tired old town, yeah, where dust and poverty are just endemic, and you hear these little echoes of the era all through the book. Nothing to fear but fear itself was the recent slogan, and there are these occasional references to WPA jobs.
Works Progress Administration.
Exactly. It immediately roots us in this era of intense economic despair. And, when a community is struggling like that, economically, social tensions just get exacerbated. The need for a clear, defined outgroup becomes even more powerful for the people who are just barely holding on.
So it's this critical, backward-looking gaze that makes it so powerful, publishing it just as the civil rights movement was gaining momentum.
It acts as a devastating critique of the inherent foundational failures of the white Southern judicial system, especially when dealing with Black defendants like Tom Robinson. It basically showed the American mainstream what that system actually looked like from the inside.
So if we had to distill the book's central thesis down to just plain language, what would it be?
I think fundamentally, the novel argues that systemic prejudice distorts perception.
Right.
It makes justice totally impossible when the community consensus, which is built on this inherited racial and class superiority, is prioritized over demonstrable fact.
And that's where true courage comes in.
That's what Atticus teaches, right?
Yeah.
True courage is the willingness to confront that consensus, even when, with almost total certainty that you're going to fail.
And that, of course, brings us to the title, to the central metaphor.
Exactly. The mockingbird, this innocent creature that only provides good things, music, joy. It becomes a symbol for anyone who is vulnerable to this systemic cruelty.
Like Tom Robinson. Or B. Radley.
Both of them. It's a sin to harm them because they've done nothing but good. And that systemic failure to protect innocence, that is the real crime the book exposes.
Let's jump into the social mechanisms of Macomb, because you really can't understand the trial without first understanding the town's its layered social geography.
No, you can't.
So let's start with what you call Macomb's rigid social tiers. It feels less like a democracy and more like I don't know, a deeply entrenched caste system.
It absolutely is a caste system, and it's layered by respectability, which is often independent of actual cash wealth.
That's the key distinction, isn't it? It's not about how much money you have in the bank.
Not at all. It's a place where social capital often outweighs financial capital. And we can, I think, clearly delineate 3 tiers of white society.
Okay, so what's at the top?
At the very top, you have the established families, like the Finches. They're educated, they're refined, they're related by blood or marriage to nearly every family in the town. They have the highest social standing, even though Atticus is relatively modest financially.
It's their lineage, their roots.
It's their lineage, yeah. Tracing all the way back to Simon Finch, the rich apothecary, that history gives them these unshakable roots in the community.
And then below them, you have the Cunninghams. And I find them the most interesting class because they represent this kind of complicated integrity.
They're fascinating. They're poor farmers from a place called Old Sarum, but they are fiercely respectable. They absolutely refuse charity. And this is where that Great Depression context just hits so hard.
Because they could get help, but they won't.
Right. The Cunninghams adhere to this incredibly strict ethical code. They refuse WPA jobs because, as Atticus explains to Scout, they're a set breed of men. They value their self-sufficiency and their freedom, including the freedom to vote as he pleased, more than any handout. They'd rather go hungry than accept government assistance that might compromise their independence.
And the detail about how they pay Atticus for his legal services is so crucial to understanding them.
It's perfect, isn't it? They don't pay in cash because they don't have any.
They pay in kind.
They pay in barter. Hickory nuts, stove wood, a croaker sack full of turnip greens. It's a payment that validates Atticus's work while preserving their own dignity. It's a contract between equals, just with a different form of currency.
Now let's contrast that principled poverty with the third tier, the Yule.
Oh, the Yules. The sources describe them as the absolute lowest white rung, the disgrace of Macomb for 3 generations.
They're illiterate, filthy, they live like animals.
Yes, and they are accommodated by the county, not respected by it. They have 0 social capital, but they possess the ultimate systemic currency.
Whiteness.
Whiteness. And this is where we hit the key systemic point about this whole tiering system. Something that really proves the Yules are functionally part of the system's maintenance crew.
Their lowest caste whiteness grants them special, almost perverse privileges that the highly respectable but poor Cunninghams do not get. So what are those privileges?
Well, the system essentially looks the other way. It allows the Yules to break laws that would land anyone else in serious trouble. Atticus tells Scout that the common folk of Macomb have agreed to become blind to some of the Yules' activities.
Like what?
Well, Burris Yule is legally exempt from school after attending only the first day. He literally shows up and says, he's done my time for this year. And Bob Yule is allowed to hunt and trap out of season, even though everyone knows he'll never change his ways.
That accommodation is just fascinating. The system tolerates their criminality, their filth. It almost encourages it, in a way.
It needs them to. It needs them to maintain the unchallengeable boundary between white and black. By granting the Yules this entitlement to be lawbreakers and shiftless, an entitlement denied to every single black person in the county, and even to the Cunninghams who have to obey the law to maintain their respectability, it ensures a massive, clear, unchallengeable gap.
So the Yules are the floor.
They are the floor. Their very existence reinforces the fragile racial superiority felt by every other struggling white citizen in Macomb. They ensure everyone else is above something.
So if the social hierarchy is that rigid, we should probably look at how the institutions Macomb relies on, like the school, either reinforce or, challenge those tiers.
And that brings us right to our next insight: institutional inertia and educational failure.
Right, and the arrival of Miss Caroline Fisher, the young teacher, is just a perfect demonstration of an institution failing spectacularly when its theoretical framework clashes with grim social reality.
She's a total outsider. She's from North Alabama, specifically Winston County, which had a history of bucking the deep Southern trend. So she comes in with these abstract, almost Northern-influenced teaching methods.
And she tries to impose these new ideas, like the stories about talking cats and this confusing Dewey Decimal System for reading cards.
And it clashes violently with the survival-based, practical local culture of Macomb. She makes these immediate, profound cultural missteps.
The first one is with Scout.
Immediately, she punishes Scout for already knowing how to read, tells Atticus he needs to undo the damage. She sees local, independent learning as an institutional threat.
The idea that Scout learned to read from her father's newspaper and from Calpurnia teaching her cursive from Blackstone's commentaries, that's outside her curriculum, so it must be wrong.
It has to be corrected. She's trying to shoehorn this rich, complex child into a theoretical box, and then comes the confrontation with Walter Cunningham.
He tries to give him lunch money.
And she is completely unaware of the Cunninghams' decades-long principled refusal of charity. She tries to shame him for something that is, to him, a point of honor.
The irony is just so sharp it hurts.
It is. Scout, who is already reading complex legal texts, is being told she's damaged by her own curiosity. Meanwhile, the school system is so irrelevant and ineffective that the Yules are legally exempted from attending at all.
The institution is designed for a theoretical, middle-class student.
Which makes it worse than useless for the actual children of Macomb who need practical knowledge to navigate their world.
Scout says she feels cheated out of something.
And she is. She's cheated out of a school that understands and respects the practical realities of her life.
And that leads us, it has to the ultimate crucible of the novel's critique.
The legal system.
The legal system as a tool of social maintenance. The court in Macomb is not designed to find empirical truth or justice.
Not at all. It is designed solely to uphold the existing social contracts and, above all, the racial hierarchy.
We have to spend some time on the physical facts of the case, because Atticus lays them out so clearly for the jury, and yet they're just ignored.
The evidence is overwhelming. Tom Robinson has a physically useless left arm. It was caught in a cotton gin when he was a child.
And Mayella Yule's injuries.
The bruises, the cuts, the black eye, they are all on the right side of her face.
Consistent with a beating from a left-handed assailant.
And Atticus demonstrates that Bob Yule, the father, is left-handed. He's the only person who could have inflicted those injuries. He successfully dismantles the entire Yule testimony, revealing Mayella's heartbreaking confusion and her shame.
But the truth just doesn't matter. Not when it conflicts with the established social order.
No. The system demanded a verdict that protected the sanctity of a white woman's word, regardless of her character, against a black man's demonstrable innocence.
What's so fascinating about the jury, though, is the small crack that appears in the system's facade.
Right. Atticus notes that the jury, which is composed mostly of farmers, takes considerable wearing down. They debate for several hours, which is unusual. The usual is just a few minutes.
Which suggests one of them was fighting it.
It heavily implies that one member, almost certainly a Cunningham, wrestled with his conscience.
That struggle is a moment of individual moral potential, but it ultimately fails.
It does. The key systemic point is that the incentive for that jury is fundamentally conservative. Protect the underlying racial hierarchy. To acquit Tom Robinson would not only insult the Yule family, the lowest white caste, but it would destabilize the entire system.
It would establish black innocence as a legal fact that could challenge white testimony.
And that's a bridge too far. The juror ultimately surrenders to systemic pressure. And this just reinforces the bitter truth Atticus knew from the very start. He was licked 100 years before we started. The system's primary function is stability and hierarchy, not abstract justice.
Shifting gears a little, let's move to the narrative of the outsider. We call it the Boo Radley effect.
This is about how fear and social isolation are powerful systemic tools. They're used to create these malevolent community narratives that reinforce conformity.
And Boo Radley is the walking example of this.
He is. He's mythologized entirely through fear and sensational gossip, fueled mostly by the neighborhood scold, Miss Stephanie Crawford.
She's the one who claims he drove scissors into his father's leg and eats raw squirrels.
Exactly. And the source of the mythology isn't just some alleged past crime. It's the Radley family's complete and total isolation.
They just didn't participate.
They did not go to church, Macomb's principal recreation. Their isolation itself became an unforgivable predilection in Macomb.
That refusal to participate gave the community a blank canvas.
A canvas to project all of its anxieties onto. And Atticus gives us the deep systemic analysis here. He tells Jem that Mr. Radley created a ghost through other ways of making people into ghosts, implying psychological control, isolation, suppression, things far more damaging than literal chains.
So the community needs the Boo Radley narrative.
Yeah. It needs it to define what's normal and what's scary. It provides a safe, gothic distraction from the real dangers.
And this is the key systemic point. The phantom narrative diverts attention from the real, immediate dangers operating in plain sight.
And the real danger is Bob Ewell's internal domestic cruelty, the implied incest and abuse of Mayella. That is far more destructive than anything the reclusive Boo Radley ever did.
So the community gossips about the phantom across the street while ignoring the literal violence next door.
Precisely. And Boo's quiet benevolence, the gifts in the knothole, the blanket he puts on Scout during the fire, and ultimately him protecting the children, it directly contradicts the public narrative. It reveals the community's own massive failure of perception. We're constantly reminded of the gap between public rumor and private truth. The things that happen to people we never really know.
Okay, finally, let's explore our last core idea, the systemic hypocrisy of moral outrage. This deals with the mechanisms Macomb uses to externalize its conscience and avoid local conflict.
This scene, set during Aunt Alexandra's Missionary Society meetings, is just a masterclass in performative morality.
You have the white ladies of Macomb, and they are intensely focused on the distant suffering of the Marooners tribe in Africa.
Yes, they express horror at their sin and squalor, and they raise money for this saintly missionary, J. Grimes Everett.
Why the Marooners?
Because their suffering is geographically distant, it's historically abstract, and helping them requires absolutely no risk to the local power structure. It is intellectually safe. It allows them to feel Christian and compassionate without doing the dangerous work of confronting their own immediate local prejudice.
But the moment the conversation turns to local issues,
the mask slips. In the very same breath, they discuss Tom Robinson's conviction with shocking callousness. Mrs. Merriweather, who is the most vocal proponent of saving the Marooners, starts complaining about sulky darkies being dissatisfied after the trial.
and she indirectly criticizes Atticus for stirring them up by defending Tom with too much vigor.
The audacity is just astonishing. She's condemning distant injustice while actively complaining about the one person in town who is trying to fight local injustice, her own neighbor.
So the key systemic point here is that this moral externalization is a necessary defense mechanism.
It is. It's for the comfortable self-deceiver. It lets them feel morally superior without engaging in the system-challenging work of addressing immediate local inequality. It's an insulated form of performative empathy.
Until Miss Maudie calls them out.
And she does it so perfectly when she challenges them by asking if Atticus's food doesn't stick going down while they criticize him. She's directly pointing out their complicity and their moral cowardice.
That detailed geography of Macomb shows us all the pieces. Now let's try to map out how these pieces interact and function as a system.
Okay.
We need to identify the key actors, their incentives, and the feedback loops that keep this society running in what is really a destructive circle.
Let's start by defining our main actors based on their role in either maintaining or challenging the system.
Okay, so first we have the power brokers, the people maintaining tradition. This is the segment dedicated to preserving the established order.
And Alexandra fits here perfectly. She's obsessed with the Finch family, reputation, lineage, social stratification.
She's the one who tries to stop Scout from socializing with the Cunninghams because they're not our kind of folks.
Right. She even invents stories about them having a drinking streak a mile wide. Then you have the jury. They aren't individual villains necessarily, but a corporate entity. They represent the consensus of white property owners, and their job is to reinforce the racial code.
And don't forget Mr. Nathan Radley.
Good one. He enforces isolation on Boo by cementing up the knothole in the tree, cutting off Boo's only benevolent connection to the outside world. A clear act of traditional authority preserving its isolation.
Okay, so on the flip side, we have the maligned and marginalized. This is the system's casualty list.
Which starts with the entire black community. Tom Robinson, his wife Helen, who has to walk miles out of her way to avoid the Ewells' harassment. They are all structurally marginalized.
And Calpurnia, who is so essential to the Finches, is marginalized by expectation.
Calpurnia's story is so critical here. She has to constantly switch between proper grammar at the Finch home and the vernacular at the First Purchase Church.
She explains it to Scout.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, she says, when they don't want to learn, there's nothing you can do to keep your mouth shut or talk their language. This code switching, it's a systemic necessity for survival.
And we also have to include white outcasts in this group, like Boo Radley, who is defined by community fear.
And even Mayella Ewell, she's technically white, but she's so low caste that the rules of accommodation don't even extend to her internal life. Nobody said that's just their way about the Ewells when it came to their family issues. She's uniquely decent to Tom Robinson because socially she has nothing left to lose.
Finally, we have to identify the moral agents, the people working at the edges of the system.
These are the people who use their position or their wealth or their quiet influence to push back. Atticus obviously doing the unpleasant jobs for the town.
Miss Maudie, the clear-eyed neighbor who challenges hypocrisy with such devastating clarity.
And crucially, Sheriff Hectate, who, at the end, chooses moral discretion over legal reporting by insisting Bob Ewell fell on his knife. He actively subverts the system.
So now that we have the players, let's look at the incentives driving behavior. What motivates these actors to stay in their lane or, cross the line?
First, and I think most universally, is social survival. This is a powerful core human need.
Like with Dill.
Exactly. Dill runs away from his indifferent parents because they just wasn't interested in me. It shows that the need for attention and belonging drives so much of Macomb's obsession with respectability and conformity.
And that fear of exclusion is what causes Jem's desperate act of rage when he tears up Mrs. DuBose's camellias after she calls Atticus a nigger lover.
The fear of that social label is so powerful it forces the children of the most respectable man in town into these violent outbursts.
Second incentive.
Racial supremacy. This undergirds the entire legal failure of the trial. The whole town tacitly agrees that Bob Ewell, even though he's trash, has to be believed because Mayella is a white accuser.
And this is reinforced by the capital punishment law for rape in Alabama.
Yes. The system grants Bob Ewell this intrinsic, unassailable value simply for the color of his skin, a value that is completely denied to Tom Robinson, regardless of his moral character. This is the ultimate system protection.
And third, there's the incentive of avoidance of conflict. This is what causes systemic apathy, right?
Completely. Why do the stout Macomb citizens avoid jury duty? Atticus explicitly explains it's the fear of damaging business relationships. Mr. Link Diaz, for example, wouldn't want to lose Miss Maudie's business by taking a side in such a contentious, racialized case.
That desire for tranquility, for just keeping the business status quo, it's critical.
It outweighs the duty of justice. And that leaves the jury to be filled by the poor white farmers from Old Sarum, the very people who feel their social standing is most dependent on upholding the racial prejudice. The system is flawed not just by malice, but by the convenience of apathy.
These motivations are all shaped by some powerful narratives and assumptions, and the most potent narrative weapon has to be the nigger lover label.
Oh, absolutely. That term, used by Francis, Mrs. DuBose, and others, is a systemic weapon of conformity. Its primary function is to enforce the racial system and keep white citizens from questioning the status quo.
Even those who might have moral qualms.
Especially them. Atticus recognizes its power, but tries to insulate Scout by dismissing it as meaningless bathroom invective, a way to strip the word of its malice just for her sake.
And the most tragic narrative is Mayella's shame. She is functionally trapped.
She is. The narrative she is forced to uphold, blaming Tom for the abuse, is the only way she can escape the twin shames of Macomb society.
What are the two shames?
The first is breaking the racial code, a white woman pursuing a black man. And the second, which is maybe even more immediate and humiliating in Macomb, is the exposure of her domestic reality living in filth with an abusive father. She sacrifices Tom Robinson to preserve the fragile remnants of her social standing. Her lie is a systemic response to a systemic trap.
All of these incentives and narratives create these powerful feedback loops that just reinforce the destructive outcomes. Let's look at two critical loops.
The primary one is the loop of entitlement. Bob Ewell believes the system owes him protection and validation simply for being white.
And the guilty verdict, despite all the clear evidence against him, validates his lie.
It validates his lie and reinforces his sense of unearned entitlement.
And what happens when that entitlement gets validated?
It fuels his violent grudge against Atticus and the children. The system's capitulation to his lie means he escalates. First, he curses and spits on Atticus. Then he threatens Helen Robinson. And ultimately, he escalates to the final, fatal attack on Jem and Scout. The system, by upholding the hierarchy, inadvertently empowers him to perpetuate harm until his death.
And the tragic counterpoint to that is the cycle of despair.
Yes. Tom Robinson's conviction, based purely on systemic racial bias, leads directly to his despair and his flight from prison. He shot 17 times while climbing a fence.
17 times.
And that violent outcome brutally reinforces the Black community's deeply ingrained understanding that fairness is impossible under this white-dominated system.
And that hostility forces the community to create its own internal safety net.
Exactly. Reverend Sykes collecting that $10 for Helen Robinson is a perfect example. It's a necessary institutional response to systemic exclusion. It shows that when the dominant system is actively hostile, the marginalized have to rely solely on self-organization for survival.
When we look at Maycomb through the systems lens, we realize we're seeing the blueprint for so much modern inequality and institutional failure.
It's chilling.
It really is. So it's critical to connect Maycomb's mechanics to our present day, starting with institutions and the two standards of justice.
The Ewell privilege, this idea that Bob Ewell can break laws like truancy or hunting out of season without consequence, just gives a social position, that connects directly to modern debates about policing and selective enforcement.
How so?
Well, think about how minor quality of life infractions are policed so strictly in marginalized communities, while, say, wealthy individuals or those with entrenched social connections often receive systemic tolerance or leniency for similar or even greater infractions.
It's the difference between being viewed as a problem to be corrected versus a criminal to be punished.
Exactly. The privilege exists not just in overt wealth, but in inherited social tolerance. And then there's the problem of the jury system. Atticus notes that the stout Maycomb citizens aren't interested in serving.
That's a clear link to modern civic disengagement, isn't it?
It is. When qualified, educated, or impartial citizens opt out of essential civic duties like jury service, the justice system is left to those who are most readily available, or those who hold the racial and class prejudices most tightly. The system becomes structurally damaged by apathy.
So when you have high opt-out rates among certain demographics, you just perpetuate the systemic imbalance. This supposedly neutral process becomes inherently skewed.
Just through the inertia of convenience and the fear of personal cost. And that inertia also fuels the politics of false narratives and othering.
Like with Boo Radley and Miss Gates.
Right. The process of making Boo Radley a malevolent phantom resonates so profoundly with the speed and scale of othering in modern communication, especially on social media.
Public perception gets distorted by sensationalism and rumor like Miss Stephanie Crawford's gossip over factual evidence.
And we see this today where a complicated figure or group is quickly reduced to a two-dimensional bogeyman, the unknown outsider, to distract from the known immediate dangers inside our own communities.
And then there's the episode with Miss Gates, the teacher, where she expresses genuine outrage over Hitler's persecution of the Jews.
But then, moments later, she displays this extreme local prejudice. She tells Scout, there are no better people in the world than the Jews, only to immediately turn around and say that Black citizens in Maycomb were getting way above themselves.
She selectively applies her moral principles. She can condemn distant historical injustice. Hitler is safely dead and far away, but she's blind to or actively participating in immediate local oppression.
It's a classic defensive narrative mechanism. It lets people maintain a moral identity. I am a good person who cares about suffering, without risking the immense social cost of challenging their own community's power structure. They outsource their conscience.
The final implication here relates to hidden labor and necessary deceit, which we see so clearly through Calpurnia.
Her required linguistic code switching is such a profound insight into navigating hostile systems.
It's not just an inconvenience for her.
No, it is exhausting, invisible, emotional labor. She speaks proper English at the Finch home, but she deliberately switches to vernacular at her church because, as she notes, if she spoke proper English there, she'd be seen as showing off and causing unnecessary friction.
She has to talk their language for the sake of community.
And that reflects the draining, often invisible labor required for marginalized individuals to navigate diverse professional and social environments today. To survive and belong in both the dominant professional world and their own community, they have to strategically deploy or suppress elements of their identity language, culture, mannerisms. It's a constant balancing act performed just to exist comfortably.
And Atticus recognizes her value, But Calpurnia herself knows the systemic realities that force her to maintain these separate linguistic identities.
Her survival strategy is a constant, subtle act of intellectual deference, just to maintain peace in two mutually suspicious worlds.
Mockingbird provides just extraordinary material for examining our broader themes of systems and perception. One of the biggest tensions we explore is systems versus individual blame.
The verdict is where this theme really crystallizes. Jem, seeing the overwhelming evidence dismissed, he views the outcome as an individual failure. It ain't right, he says, raging at the injustice of the men in the jury box.
But Atticus steps in and explains that the failure is structural.
Exactly. He explains it's the deeply entrenched system, the law, the structure of the jury, the deep-seated prejudice of the community that determined the outcome. The result was predictable, not just tragic.
And this structural understanding leads to the final, really complex ethical choice made by Sheriff Hecate. He decides Bob Ewell fell on his knife. He chooses to lie to protect Boo Radley.
It's a fascinating moment of moral tension. Doesn't that fundamentally undermine the very rule of law that Atticus spent the entire trial upholding? Does a single moral choice justify systemic legal deceit?
It's a paradox, isn't it? Atticus defends the law rigorously in the courtroom.
But Hecate argues that in this fundamentally flawed system, hauling Boo Radley, a traumatized reclusive mockingbird who only acted benevolently into court even as a hero, would be a sin. It would be the equivalent of killing a mockingbird.
So it shows the limits of formal justice.
It does. Moral protection, Hecate decides, requires actively intervening against the standard procedure of the law when the system itself is deemed too cruel or insufficient to protect the innocent. He performs an act of higher, personalized justice outside the formal structure.
Another powerful theme here is power hidden inside neutral processes. Atticus appears to be just doing his professional duty.
But Miss Maudie recognizes that he is performing the town's unpleasant jobs because of a collective decision by the power structure.
She explains to the children that others were unwilling to risk the personal cost. She says that if they did what Atticus was doing, it might lose them a nickel.
And that phrase is just devastating. It means that power resides not just in those who actively oppress, but also in those who benefit from the status quo tranquility, social standing, business success, by remaining silently complicit.
They outsource their moral risk to Atticus, who is financially secure enough to absorb the hit.
Right. The town wants to maintain a veneer of decency, so they need someone to perform the necessary moral acts, but they will never risk their own comfort or capital to do it themselves.
Finally, let's look at moral narratives embedded in institutions. We saw the court as a hostile institution.
But the First Purchase M.E. Church provides an alternative institutional narrative.
Unlike the county courthouse, which failed completely, the church provides a safety net.
Absolutely. The church's strict requirement for a specific collection amount, Reverend Sykes insisting, nobody leaves here till we have $10 for Tom Robinson's wife. That is a necessary institutional response to systemic exclusion. They organize their own safety net when the dominant system fails completely, forcing every single member to contribute to the collective survival.
And their method of worship, the lining of the hymns without hymn books because few can read, that's a deep communal act.
Born of necessity and poverty, and it reinforces their internal strength and unity in the face of external hostility. It's a narrative of resilience, embedded in their very form of worship.
So when we step back, what does To Kill a Mockingbird really help us see differently?
I think it shows us that a system of segregation and prejudice is sustained not just by overt hatred, but by far more insidious forces. Comfortable self-deception, like the Missionary Society, and the community's prioritization of social stability, like the Ewell accommodation over moral truth.
It teaches us to look past superficial respectability and identify where power truly lies.
In consensus, in silence, and in institutional inertia.
And why this perspective matters today is that it forces you, the listener, to confront the idea that in a prejudiced system, just being a good person is not enough.
It's insufficient. Atticus Finch is the definition of a good man, but he has to act outside of his own self-interest. He has to accept immense social consequences, being cursed, spat on, having his children attacked, just to uphold basic principles.
True morality in a flawed system often demands dangerous confrontation, not quiet contemplation.
And the ultimate question the book raises, the one that connects the courtroom tragedy to the hidden heroism of Boo Radley, is about the definition of justice itself. The most moral act in the entire book protecting Boo Radley requires the local law, Hecate, to lie and disregard legal procedure.
Declaring Bob Ewell fell on his knife.
Right.
So does this suggest that when a system is fundamentally and irrevocably flawed, true justice is achieved only through strategic subversion, through protecting the innocent, the mockingbirds, from that very system? If the law can't be trusted to protect innocence, then moral agents have to step outside the law to achieve a higher justice. That makes Hecate a necessary system defier, just as Atticus was a necessary system challenger. That's a challenging idea to sit with, especially when we consider the power of institutions today.
There really is.
This deep dive was based on the landmark work of American literature, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee.
We encourage you to seek out and read the book yourself to appreciate the nuance and depth of Harper Lee's storytelling. Support the author if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.